Thank you. It's great to be back in Hong Kong. I will try to keep my remarks brief so we can get to the panel. And what I want to talk about is not a comprehensive view of governance, but just some examples of where we're at right now in terms of governance, particularly in the Western developed world, because I think that is where those countries have focused their efforts primarily, to be quite frank. The two examples in particular I'd like to look at are the European Union and the United States, because I think they represent two paradigm approaches to regulation. So the first, I apologize in advance if any of this is outdated. As many of you probably know, the EU trilogue process appears to have just completed within the last 12 hours. So based on my cursory understanding of what has been published since then, I believe this still applies. But the EU approach, I think, we classify it as a horizontal risk classification exercise that's primarily driven through the legislature. Those are kind of the defining features. What it does in substance is sorts AI applications into these different risk categories. So at the highest level, these are unacceptable risk categories that are they're prohibited. There's essentially no context in which these applications would be acceptable. Some examples of that are biometric categorization systems that use sensitive characteristics such as political, religious, philosophical beliefs, sexual orientation, or race, potentially with some exceptions for law enforcement, but those appear to be very narrowly constructed. Untargeted scraping of facial images from the internet, emotion recognition and behavioral manipulation in the workplace and educational institutions, social scoring based on social behavior or personal characteristics. I think that those applications have been well reported earlier than the past 12 hours, so there appears to be not a lot of change on those applications. The next category down is looking at these high-risk applications that are permitted but with ex-ante compliance. And so that means you need to proactively demonstrate that your models, your products are safe. An example of that would be algorithmic recruitment in human resources. It is not necessarily prohibited, but you're going to have to submit compliance requirements ahead of deploying those types of models. It's interesting to see what maybe we'll see if when we get more information on the trilogue process that's concluded where general purpose AI models fall. My reading is that they fit in this third category, which is AI that has specific transparency obligations ex post. So there are reporting requirements after training, after deployment, responsibilities that the developers of these models need to submit to. But that is an ex post regulation rather than submitting to compliance requirements before taking those steps. And really importantly, I think it's lost in this debate a lot about how effective the EU regulation will be, is all other applications that they do not specifically note are permitted. And so that leaves quite a huge world of AI that is not subject to these requirements. Now we have the United States approach. The law of the land in the U.S. now is the executive order on AI, as we refer to it. There are some binding requirements in the executive order, and I think there's been a lot of attention about that access as well as the reversible nature of the executive order, and I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification for 4 reasons. One is some of this is binding, if not backed by legislation. So, for example, all federal agencies being required to appoint a chief AI officer, that's a requirement. Agencies have a fixed time period. They have to do that. The second reason is the direction of federal agencies is to produce binding rules. So through the rulemaking process, federal agencies will determine within their existing remits what are the binding compliance rules that companies will have to face. And it's not just algorithm developers either. It's anyone who's using an AI product or service in any way. I mean, it could be a very vast regulatory space. When you think about, there are over 100 federal institutions that engage in this type of policymaking. The third point I want to make on this is some of these steps may be functionally irreversible, but in practice, it's difficult to imagine them actually being reversed. So, for example, if we have a new administration in the United States in January 2025, will they be able to kick out all of the AI talent in the federal government? Potentially legally, yes, but it's difficult to envision that happening because this has been a bipartisan focus for a long time. And then finally, I think for all the rhetoric there, the differences between the two parties, if we do have a change in administrations next year, actually the two main policy areas where you see significant continuity between Presidents Biden and Trump are China and AI. And actually, this AI policy looks very similar to a 2019 executive order that President Trump had enacted in many ways. In some ways, you could see this as an evolution of that earlier, more skeletal framework. So we love sorting countries into one of these two paradigms, and I think this is just a quick example of some of the different approaches that countries have taken. I think of the pros and cons actually being relatively difficult to discern because I think a lot of that stems on the local political environment. The way I think of the difference in these approaches is what is your tolerance for harm? In the executive action approach, there will be some harms. Now, certainly with existential risk, AI catastrophes, we can't tolerate any harms, but there will be cases where we have an algorithm that comes to a faulty conclusion, there are alignment problems, and people suffer from harms that then they litigate in the judicial system. The view is that if you tolerate some of those harms, potentially you have a more specific regulatory regime that evolves in response to those. That's one of the advantages. If you don't feel you can tolerate those harms, taking a legislative prescriptive approach is going to be much more effective at preventing those types of harms. But ultimately, I think it's important not to overestimate the differences here. These are two groups of principles that have emerged over the last several weeks. You have the Bletchley-Park principles that were developed at the EU AI Safety Summit in the beginning of November. And just days before that, the G7 Hiroshima process on AI released their guiding principles. And this is just a summary of, on the left, how Bletchley-Park talks about risks from AI. On the right, you have some of the principles that are embedded, these important areas in terms of international collaboration for the G7. There's a lot of overlap there. And, we're talking about the European Union and the U.S. They have been in close communication with one another through both of these fora and directly. And I think it's I'm actually much more optimistic about regulatory harmonization in this era than, say, the discussions around GDPR and privacy, competition and tax, because in those policy discussions, there were disagreements on what our government's respective principles should be. I think now we're speaking the same language in terms of what the principles should be. So I personally am optimistic that we will find some way to harmonize regulation once we get down to the implementation phase. So finally, I just want to present one slide on some possibilities of cooperation based on two factors. I see collective risk and cooperation incentives. And I would love to hear from my fellow panelists later if they agree with this assessment of these different incentives. But I think these are four areas where it seems to me in the near and medium term, we could have some international agreement on governance to regulate these areas. Starting with, on the left, an area like synthetic biology, where I see the corporate cooperation incentives and government cooperation incentives to be very strong. There are clear international precedents. We have the Biological Weapons Convention that regulates biological weapons. And as Michael Salido pointed out earlier, we have biosafety standards through the BSL framework at the international level. And there are also ongoing efforts to develop technical safety restrictions for synthetic biology. I think as you move to the right of this matrix, the picture becomes more murky. But just to say it's more complicated doesn't mean I don't think we can get there in the next few years to find ways to align these incentives and potentially come up with some technical safety solutions. And just because something is novel doesn't mean we can't be the ones to figure it out and make it work in this context. So I will stop there and look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists.